Ladies and gentlemen, before we start the formal proceedings, it's my responsibility to tell you that if the fire alarms ring, you are to proceed out the two doors at the top of the stairs, through the main entrance, and assemble and wait in the car park until told to leave. Hopefully that won't happen. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. In this great centenary year of polar exploration and this particular date, which is 100 years since the sending from Hobart of a telegram to Norway by Roald Amundsen, there's been a lot happening in the Hobart community about Antarctica and Antarctic exploration, Antarctic history and Antarctic science. And earlier, late last year, we were provided a lecture here in which the speaker put forward the premise that Scott's noble aim was not so much to reach the South Pole, but to do science qua science, science for the sake of science. I'm not quite sure that I agree with that premise, but there's been a lot said about Antarctic exploration, the motives behind those great and famous men, and the results of what they did. It's a great privilege for us here to have a colleague of mine I've known for over a decade now, but somebody who's spent over 3 decades in polar research, polar administration, polar history and polar diplomacy. It's Dr. Olav Orheim. He's had a long and distinguished career, and he is, at the moment, the chair of the Fram Museum in Norway. He spent the last few days here in Hobart working with some colleagues, doing some long outstanding glaciological work, a study on icebergs, but also catching up with some of the local history and the nuances around Amundsen's visit to Hobart and what happened when he was here. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Olav Orheim to give tonight's lecture. Olav.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's an enormous pleasure for me to be here on this exceedingly auspicious day. And I'm going to, of course, tell you what happened here in Hobart 100 years ago. But before I get that far, I'm going to tell you about the South Pole and the discovery of the South Pole. Now, I see many familiar faces around here, and so it's with some trepidation I talk about Antarctic history when there's so many knowledgeable people here. And so those of you who know a great deal will have to forgive me if I sometimes seem to be saying the obvious. But hopefully some of you don't know everything about this. And when I made my plan for this talk and communicated with Tony Press on this, this is the title we put up here, Discovering the South Pole, and talking a little bit about his competitors, Now, having been in Hobart, I've also added a bit more into my talk on what happened here than I originally had when I came here from Norway a few days ago. So what I'm going to talk about, what happened, how was the expedition, why is there still new knowledge coming? You must think anything 100 years ago should have been well covered by now. I want to compare the three competitors, and finally a little bit on why we are in the Antarctic. Now, of course, Amundsen's story is the main source of information on the expedition. He wrote 2 books. They were translated into a large number of different languages, and nothing is changing on the basic facts. He arrived at the South Pole on 14th December, etc. However, we are getting a lot of new details, partly because people are analyzing and writing new books, and in our case in Norway, because we decided some years ago at the Fram Museum that we were going to publish all diaries of all Norwegian polar expedition members. Without exception, there's more than 100 diaries. And we started, of course, with the Amundsen diaries since the centenary was coming up. So 3 years ago, 30 volunteers started transcribing 14 diaries of these 18 people who were with Amundsen. And these diaries have not been transcribed before. They've not been read before. Small bits and pieces of some diaries have been seen. Others we didn't even know about when we started this project. And all these volunteers have sat and done this on their free time. And we published these in August last year. So this is all fresh. They've all been published in Norwegian, and we are publishing them all also in English. So this will be available for scholars to look at anywhere. And some of these are shown here. And just to give you an example, and why is this a work? Well, the diary of these people, first of all, they are writing in their own handwriting style. Of course, you get gradually to know that handwriting. But they use abbreviations. They sometimes use dialect. And here's the diary on the left, and then on the right is the a text. Of course, this is in Norwegian, so I won't start to translate that. But you can imagine there's a challenge to this. Not all the diaries were equally interesting. Some were rather short. One of these 14, we have translated them all since we wanted to, but one of them, 14, does not almost write anything at all on the expedition. He only writes love letters to his girlfriend. And he's writing and again how lovely she is and how fantastic she is and so forth, but nothing about what's happening. It's very strange. But the other 13, all of them include some gems, or some variety of gems. But also, in addition to these diaries, over the last 20-30 years, in England and in other countries, there have come enormous number of books on Scott and on Shackleton particularly. In the United States, Shackleton has grown in status as a leader, and more books have been coming out. And in the last 2 decades, I looked up and I found there was about 50 books on Shackleton alone. Now, these people are not necessarily finding new material. It's not like the diaries, but some of these books are, of course, looking at Shackleton in different light, and even more so, Scott has been looked on in a totally different light. He's both been erased as a hero, lowered at the lower levels, and gradually now he's coming slightly up into the sunshine again. I went down to your National Library here in Hobart, and I just checked up on the references, and just to give you some idea what you have here, there are 77 references on Scott publications, 65 on Shackleton. Both of them beat out your national hero, Mawson, only 56, and Amundsen only 7. Well, of course, many more books are written in Amundsen than in Norwegian also, but there are many in English. It was, of course, Roland Huntford who did a big thing on Scott, but he was not the first. I've been told by English people that there was on the Monty Python show had a story, a program which was Scott of the Sahara. which apparently was very funny, which was in the early 60s. So this started before Huntford, but Huntford was the authoritative person on this. I'll get back to this. But now for a moment to the expedition. I'm going to go this expedition briefly down in the ice, but before we get that far, let's just look at why on earth did Amundsen go to the South Pole. Now this here is from the first Fram expedition, which froze in the Arctic and drifted across the Arctic Ocean for 3 years. And this is a picture of the Fram down here. This expedition, which was Fridtjof Nansen's great breakthrough, he had already crossed Greenland, he was already a hero, but this made him a global hero, did not, as you see, quite make it to the North Pole. He actually passed in a distance here of 86 something, and he was about 500 kilometers from the North Pole. So when Amundsen went to Nansen, asked if he could borrow the Fram, he wanted to go up to the Bering Strait, just outside the picture here, and then drift across and hopefully come right across the North Pole. This is in 1907. Amundsen had gone through the Northwest Passage the year before as the first ever. He had some money and he wanted to get across the North Pole. Then while he is making his preparation, and by this time he is heavily into debt, then comes the news that first Cook and then Peary both say in the autumn of northern autumn, I should say, September of 1909, there comes the message they had been to the North Pole. Amundsen was in a quandary, and he decides to make a small detour. You know, some would say that was a big detour, but for Amundsen he said, I will just make a detour. He was going to sail down the Atlantic anyway to get around South America up into Bering Strait. Now he was just going to stop by and take the South Pole on the way. He tests whether he can actually make and recover the funds by having talking tour in England on having reached the North Pole, and he is advised that there's nothing in the North Pole anymore. The North Pole had been reached. And let's just remind ourselves, these are the days when there were no heroes like we have today. There were no Olympic champions. There were nobody even getting top of Himalaya. There were no movie stars. These were the days when geographic exploration was the greatest. Livingstone had explored the interior of Africa and been discovered, so to speak, by Stanley, and North Pole and South Pole were the remaining two jewels. The North Pole gets taken in 1909. So, in 1910, Amundsen sails south on the Fram, and on Madeira he announces his detour. And he sends the letters back announcing that he's going to the South Pole, and also sends a telegram to Scott. This is Fram ready for departure in Norway, and many questions were asked by people, but nobody confronted Amundsen in those days. Why is he taking along a house? When Nansen had drifted across the North Pole, he had lived in the ship all the time. The ship was built like an egg to be lifted up. Why does he need a house? Amundsen explained, well, I'm taking a house to have an observation house that I can put outside the ship. Why is there no hole in the bottom then to go through into the ice? Well, we'll make that later, Amundsen said. Why are you taking the dogs? Why can you not wait till you get over to Alaska? Well, I want to take the dogs from Europe, I'm sure, to get the best dogs that way. These were his explanations. Then they're crossing the equator. There are many pictures from, and all the pictures I show from now on are from his expedition. They're all originals, but some of them are painted later on because they put color on. He only had black and white camera, but they actually colored them. But those are artificial later on. Here you have the captain sitting with Miss Gjertsen, one of the participants, and they're crossing the equator and had a big party. They sailed for 4.5 months from Madeira to the Bay of Wales. In opposition to Scott, which stops in Africa, stops in Australia before he comes to New Zealand and have big parties, Amundsen sails straight from Madeira, where he sends the message. He sails straight to the Bay of Wales. He doesn't take any chances of being stopped by a telegram from Nansen, who owned the ship, and could have said, well, you shouldn't go to South Pole because that is British, because Nansen was at that point a very close friend of the British. He had been Norway's first ambassador to UK when Norway became independent in 1905. They sailed for 16,000 nautical miles. They sailed is of course the word. They had an engine, but they didn't really want to use the engine except when they were in the ice. So it took them a long time to get there. They started out with all these dogs. They stayed on deck, but they were worried about the dogs getting across the equator, so they put out these sails to make a shelter and cooler conditions for the dogs. Started out with 97. When they came to the ice, they had 116 because there were many puppies produced on the way. They rather brutally threw away all the females. The reason for that was that to have too many females was not good when you were running the dog teams. The female caused trouble. I'm not making any conclusions on that. That is the way they approached this. They were very concerned, as I say, about the dogs. In one of these pictures, they're pulling teeth of the dog. Another one down to the right, they're actually splaining. What is the word? When they've broken a leg. So that this was important to them, the well-being of the dogs. In fact, there's very much evidence that they loved the dogs. They were, if you like, pragmatic about the dogs, but they really loved the dogs. And Amundsen himself was unable to kill any dogs. It was from the diaries of other companions, participants, that he writes about that they had to go out and kill dogs. He wasn't able to actually do that himself. January 1911, into the Ross Sea, and here's what they sailed. This is also the route later on, which I'll get to that later on, but this is their sailing all the way around, coming into the Bay of Wales. He knew, of course, that Scott was coming here, leaving from McMurdo, and forget about the route there, we'll look at that later on, but this is the sailing trip coming south. They offloaded a lot of provisions, naturally. They shot a lot of seals for food for the dogs. And on the 4th of February, the Terra Nova of Scott's expedition comes sailing into the bay. And so when Scott started south, he knew about Amundsen's plans, and equally so, Amundsen knew about Scott's plans. Amundsen was worried about Scott's resources. Scott had many more resources in men, in dogs, in ponies, and in 3 motorized vehicles. And the English were boasting about how much they were getting out of the motorized vehicles, and Amundsen was worried about that. Amundsen does the same trick when he sees the English. When they arrive there, he loads up sledges, and they put almost no load onto them. They just had a lot of volume, and then they're running the dogs at a very brisk pace up from the ship and up to where he had his house. The house that he had brought down south. So they're both trying to boast a little bit to each other. This is a picture from when they meet up. There were 3 of the English who went ashore, and I'm not sure which one who took the photo, and the other 2 are standing on the right. And then here's Amundsen's group standing in front of the same house. Of course, on the ice shelf, there's snow coming in the winter, and in addition, wind is blowing snow, so that everything gets snowed down, and eventually they have a situation where they have the main house in the as a building here, and these are passageways in the snow, underneath the snow, to various working rooms, etc. Even they had a sauna, which I'll show you a picture of much later, etc., etc. Here they are working then in the snow all through the winter. Amundsen was very concerned that they should be busy, and there seems to be no difficulty keeping them busy all through the winter. Down to the right here is Hjalmar Johansen counting the biscuits. He counted one by one 56,000 biscuits that they had in the sledge rations. They're sewing the clothes, fixing clothes. They are cutting down on the sledges to make them even slightly lighter, and to make the best use of these boxes that they had on the sledges. On the left here, you see Hjalmar Johansen, who's actually packing milk powder in tin sausages, and then they were squeezed down into the they had circular tins with the biscuits, and then there would be a space between the circles, and there they squeezed down these milk sausages to fill up every gap. And Amundsen had devised an ingenious way of taking material out of the sledges. He had a lid on these boxes. He just took off the lid, and then they took out the things. They didn't have to take away everything on the sledges, in difference to one of the many things that Scott did in a less efficient way. Amundsen comes across on this expedition. You can argue about Amundsen's later personalities, but in South Pole expedition he comes across as an extremely good leader, a leader of modern types. He was democratic, he delegated practically everything. As long as nobody questioned his authority, he was very good at delegating. He set up activity which he considered important to keep them busy, and the Sunday afternoon was the only time they had free time. And on Sunday afternoon, they had two activities. Well, one activity on Sunday afternoon, that was playing darts. And every morning, all through the winter, every one of them walked outside, and they estimated what the temperature was. And then when they came inside again, they wrote that up. And both of these competitions, the one who got closer to the temperature, which then subsequently each day was measured, and the one who won in the darts, they got big prizes. In one case, a gold watch, and the other one, binoculars. But why did he do this temperature business? He was concerned that they should be able to judge the temperature when they were in the field. And the thermometers were very delicate, so he was worried that maybe they would break the thermometers on the way. So he had this exercise to keep them busy. And as I say, when you look at the way he organized the expedition, there were 9 of them who wintered over. It comes out that they were in very good spirits. Here we see them lashing sledges. You see what they look like down there. It's only one picture of all 9. They didn't have a automatic release on the camera, but somehow they managed to rig up that one picture where and we thought first time we saw this that they were having some kind of midwinter celebration. But it's not. They're actually testing out different kinds of nose protection and sunglasses. And they had no problems with sun and snow blindness on the expedition, in opposition again to Scott, who did that. So they were doing a lot of testing on this various equipment. Clothing, of course, one of the things that Amundsen, and as he learned from Nansen, was you should learn from the Inuits. And to me, one of the biggest difference between Scott and Amundsen is that Scott, coming from the Royal Navy, was steeped in the naval tradition, and the Royal Navy being the biggest navy in the world, the strongest, of course, everything the Royal Navy did was the best way. And of course, most of the time the Royal Navy won the fights. It didn't do so, though, in the polar regions. And the reason, I think, in many ways, is that they were not the culture of learning from primitive people. Amundsen is 13 or 14 years old when he reads about the Northwest Passage, and he gets completely taken in by the Franklin story. And it's neat that there's a connection with Franklin here in Tasmania. And so he has already decided to become a polar explorer at that age. And then Amundsen comes back from Greenland when Nansen comes back from Greenland when Amundsen is 17, and Nansen has spent the winter with the Inuits, and he has changed his mind on the Inuits or the Greenlanders and say these people have ways of surviving in the Arctic which we can learn from. And Amundsen then goes through the Northwest Passage, spends 2 years, 2 winters with the Inuits. Again, he's learning from them. And the clothes you see here are the kind of fur clothes that the Inuits were using. Very loose clothing, very different from what had been tradition up to this time. And Nansen says you can learn from these people. It's obvious we can learn from these people who, even though they don't have our resources, are managing to survive in the cold Arctic. That was obvious to a small country like Norwegians. It was not so obvious to a big country like the British. The trip itself is, in Amundsen's description, almost uneventful. Several times he found a new route up to the top, up through the actual Heiberg Glacier, up to the plateau. that several places are in very difficult crevassed areas. One place he calls the Devil's Dance floor. He almost makes no number out of this. It looks like everything is easy, but they're falling into in their arms, etc. But everything goes very smoothly for him. They have so much time that even on the way in, they're going only 37 kilometers only. It's not so little, but he's going that's a third of a nautical mile, and then they rest on the fourth day. They have a rest every fourth day. They use that, among other things, to build a lot of cairns on both sides of where they're leaving the food. So they have a very meticulous system for finding the food on the way out again. Well, on this relaxed way, he arrives on the South Pole on the 14th of December. They stayed there for 3 days taking sunshots. They had a lot of time. He doesn't, of course, know whether Scott was there before him. He doesn't, even though he's arrived at the South Pole, potentially Scott could have been a few kilometers away and they're not seen each other, not seen the tracks. However, he takes it very easy on the way out again, because at least he knows he has been to the South Pole, having spent all this time taking sunshots. And just to give you an information on how close they were, this distance from here to here is just over 2 kilometers. And the circle of uncertainty of the position here when they came was about 300 meters. That is the size of the circle, where they were not right on the spot. That was as close as he could determine, having taken sunshots for 24 hours. And of course at the South Pole, the sun doesn't dip. Everywhere else it dips in the south, and it has a high point in the north. Here it's slowly going up or slowly going down. At this point, just before the 23rd of December, it's still slowly going up. And they get as close as they can. But then later on, when one recalculates his positions, his observation, we know, of course, what the sun elevation was exactly at the South Pole on the 17th, when the last day, or the 16th of December, when he takes his final 24 hours. And we can work out what errors there were in the instrument. And that was done in the 1920s, a recalculation of all his positions. And that's how we know he was within 300 meters, even though he thought he was within 2 kilometers of the position. Since that time, the tent has drifted in this position here. This is the Greenwich. Here is down to New Zealand. We are down in this direction to Hobart. So this is the ice flow, and it's about 10 meters a year. So now the tent is just slightly closer to the South Pole, and it's now buried 17 meters below the surface, and it will never be taken away from there because it's now protected. Now, they return after 99 days to the Bay of Wales. The Fram is already arrived from where it wintered over in the Buenos Aires, and then they're heading south. And as we all know, Scott perished down here. I'm getting this working right here. On the last entry in the diaries on the 29th of March, and by that time, long before then, in February, the Terra Nova had gone back to New Zealand. But of course, at that point, nobody knew what had happened to Scott. Now, to take the route now and to get to Hobart, we are sailing here. He doesn't write, to my knowledge, anything on why he doesn't go to the nearest point, New Zealand, but it's very likely and very easy to imagine that he knew that Scott was sailing out from New Zealand, so he didn't want to go where Scott was, and so he goes the slightly further distance to Hobart. Hobart was the second closest place of civilization. And as we know, he arrives here on the 7th of March. Now, over the last days, I've been reading all the diaries of all the people who were on the ship to see what they are writing when they come into Hobart. But to give you the setting, first of all, when Amundsen arrives, on the 7th they come in, they pick up a pilot, and he asks of news of the pilot. Pilot doesn't have any news of interest to Amundsen. The only interest, of course, to him is whether they've heard of Scott. Amundsen and the rest of the crew do not say a word to the pilot or to anybody else on what the status is. They anchor, then they go in, don't go into the to the dock. They go anchor out in the harbor. Amundsen goes with the pilot and goes ashore and takes in on Hadleys. is treated as being covered by your newspapers, like a sailor, like a tramp. He doesn't actually, he's not very upset by that, because he's not going to let on who he is, and so he's given the worst room that they have probably in the hotel. They're not sure that he will pay, but he goes immediately to the post office, and that afternoon sends 3 telegrams, one to his brother Leon, one to the King of Norway, and one to Fridtjof Nansen, the owner of the ship. And in the telegrams are basically identical, saying South Pole had been reached. Nothing more, no story. And then he goes back and waits for a telegram from his brother Leon, who was his business manager and who had been now on his own for 18 months without communicating with Roald. And on the 8th he gets a telegram from Leon where he is to send the telegrams on the story. Because Leon had then, in the meantime, which he had started of course before that 7th, he had been negotiating with different newspapers on the best deals for selling the story. And so Amundsen then on the 8th writes long telegrams. He spends £50 sending telegrams, which you can multiply by probably at least something like 100. So he comments that it was expensive sending these long telegrams in English, in Norwegian, etc., to the leading newspapers. One in London, one in Oslo, one in Paris, one in Berlin, probably, etc. And then he goes back and sits down in the room, and in his diaries at 10 p.m. that day, in the meantime he visited the Norwegian consul, asked for news. He does that already on the 7th. There are no news, and again he just goes back. He doesn't say anymore, presumably told the consul he had reached the South Pole, but he does not talk to media. 10 p.m. that evening on the 8th, news have come to Hobart from Europe that Amundsen has reached the South Pole. That is when Hobart hears about it, and he writes in his diary that the journalists are beating on my door and trying to break into my room, and I'm not letting them in. On the 9th, the journalists want the story, but he's waiting and he's not telling anybody what's happening on the 9th. He's not giving any interviews, because he's waiting for the telegrams to come again from his brother Leon that the story has been printed in the European papers. And this is the long story. In Aftenposten, a Norwegian newspaper, on the 7th of March, they say Amundsen has reached Hobart, no news of what has happened. That's on the 7th. And that message comes from a Reuters news agency who sent that message from Hobart. And on the 7th of March, an English newspaper interpreted that to mean that Amundsen was not the first one. And so there's flagging in London on the 7th of March. On the 8th of March, the newspaper in Aftenposten saying South Pole reached, all well, nothing more, same in England, same elsewhere, South Pole reached. On the 9th of March, eventually comes the story which covered the whole front page of Aftenposten, where he describes the dates when they, and of course also says he saw nothing of Scott. Once he on the 9th gets the news from his brother, presumably in the evening again, then he opens up for media and he allows people to go ashore on the 10th, and on the 11th he has a media comes ashore and they take pictures of the whole group. And the next pictures here are actually from that time. So here's the situation on the 8th of March. On the 9th of March, he gets 65 congratulatory telegrams coming from Europe. Another 50 comes the next day. So now the news are coming, but as I say, they're coming from Europe. But it is the journalists in Hobart who are the first ones to interview him and ask questions. Everybody else is getting the story the way he sent it. And now on the 11th, and this and the next few pictures, there are photographers coming on board. And I've quoted some, just to give you some flavor of how the people on the rest of his group felt about this. And when I was looking at this, I expected that on them writing in the diaries that on the 8th of March You know, or the 9th of March, they were writing, "Oh, can we not go ashore soon? Can we not see some women?" You know, but actually they're pretty laconic about this. Presumably they've been away for 1.5 years. They can last a couple of more days, or whatever they were thinking. But there's no issue of irritation. But Prestrud, when they sail in here on the 9th of March, he says, "Imagine we arrived sheltered Hobart with pretty houses and people are living." You know, fancy that. And then his last diary, which I thought was a sort of education of type, and many of them, when it gets to the end of this day, they stayed till 20th of March, they are actually feeling it's getting too much. There are too many parties, there's too much going on. Let's get out at sea again, get away from this. And on the 20th of March, the same Prestrud, he says, obviously it was on the 19th, and that there had been a picnic arranged by the US consul, took place too late. Met Miss Taylor from Sydney, but what is the use? Today we leave for Buenos Aires. So we don't really know whatever happened. If there was any meeting of women, it's not written in any of the diaries that we have seen. But here's another one. On the 11th of March, Amundsen gives everyone £0.5 to spend ashore, and most of them went ashore. Most of them, of course, went drinking. And on the next day, Hassel is writing, went ashore and pulled a tooth. Teeth, of course, was a challenge in those days for many of them. Johansen has started drinking, will be sent home now. Johansen, of course, is one of these sad cases, the big sad case in this expedition, which is another story. Took a tram, in case you didn't know it, you had a tram then. Met the others who gone ashore, stopped and had some glasses. And they're pretty much that kind of stories. The media was also, perhaps because of the Franklin connection, asked to have pictures of those on board that had also gone through the Northwest Passage. And these texts, incidentally, at the bottom are the way these are in your collection of photographs here. These are all from Edward Sale's album of photographs, which are called Australia, Antarctica, Pacific, 1911 to 1915. And in the middle of the front sequence is this one, when the Mawson Aurora is leaving for the Antarctic 3 months later. Mawson returns on the 12th of March. It was just a day or two after Amundsen has opened up for his story. And Amundsen goes on board a day or two later, and he gives Mawson 21 dogs, which formed the basis for many of the dogs for the Australian expedition. He gave them all the dogs except the 11 dogs that had been to the South Pole. The ones who had gone to the South Pole were going to come back to Norway in honor. And there were also some puppies that Mawson didn't get. But he got enough to get started on with the Huskies. And here you see the last picture of Amundsen again. All of these were taken on the same day, on the 11th of March. Then Amundsen, his photographs are tainted, given in color, and made into lantern slides. And then he goes on his first lecture talk here in Australia, in the mainland, when he tells all about this. This, I don't have a slide from his poster from Australia. This is much later when he's talking in England. But this is how you see this was advertised everywhere. He made a lot of money from those, much more money from the talks and from the books than he made from this first exclusive to the newspapers. But the first to the newspapers were important at a time when he was heavily in debt. At this stage, nobody still knows anything about Scott. And some people in England especially are speculating that maybe Scott was first and they didn't meet up. Nobody knows, of course, that he died, but he could have come just too late to reach the Terra Nova going north. I said I would show the sauna. This picture here is actually from down in the snow, and in the New York Times and his lecture talk, they thought this was the most interesting in the whole thing. If you can see here, you see a primus underneath, so he heated up, and his water here, and here was the head of the person sticking outside, and the rest of us was inside this, and the sort of steam bath. Yeah, quite ingenious in its way. Yeah, but there was huge interest. Now, February 13th, 10th of February 1913, Scott comes back and becomes an instantaneous national hero. And I, perhaps slightly nastily, are saying that's also the start of rewriting history. And Tony, when you mentioned this earlier, there's no question that when Scott is going south, he has with him an enormously clever set of people, including scientists, which Amundsen did not. Scott had two dual purposes. He was going to do science, and he was going to reach the South Pole. Having said that, Scott's biggest competitor at that time was Shackleton, and Scott's most important, all his resources, most important thing was to reach the South Pole. Downplaying that later is rewriting history. It's not the way it happened. So if we compare these three heroes, they're almost the same age, as you'll see. Amundsen was pure polar exploration. He did science on the Northwest Passage. He had with him a person trained in magnetism, and himself spent several months in Germany learning how to take magnetic measurements. And they were going for the North Magnetic Pole, of course, at that time. He decided, as I say, as a teenager to become a polar explorer. Then he trained to become a mate. And then he goes on the Belgica expedition, which wintered over. The ship was beset west of the Antarctic Peninsula. Then he goes through Northwest Passage. Probably of his time, there has been no expedition leader ever who was such a meticulous planner, who was so precise in his planning and so thoroughly in all his planning. And most of the time, as long as he is not challenged, he also turns out as an excellent leader. Robert Falcon Scott, 4 years older, died on 29th or maybe 30th of March. He went down on the Discovery expedition, and compared to both Shackleton and Scott, he had much more resources. As I mentioned, he had the handicap of coming from a country with great naval traditions. He's not a very nice man. He accuses both Shackleton and Amundsen of being dishonest. He has a nasty temper. He's written up as a hero because he dies. And Oates' diary, his mother of Oates burns Oates' diary because Oates doesn't write very nicely about Scott. And when Scott was a hero, she just couldn't reconcile this with her son's descriptions. One of the sad things in this is that diary is not here. He set up a system where he tried to prevent Shackleton to go in the same area where they had been on the Terra Nova expedition, even though he was not ready with his plans at that time. Scott doesn't come across, in my opinion, as a very nice person. Shackleton, 2 years younger than Amundsen, was on the Discovery with Scott, is badly treated by Scott on that expedition. Scott writes it up in a way that you can read between the lines, that Shackleton was the one who hindered them in going further south. He comes across as an enormously competent leader in the field. He does what must have been very, very difficult when he is on 88-23, 9th of January 1909, and he decides, I'm going to turn back. He had about 160 kilometers or something like that, 170 kilometers to the South Pole. He obviously could have made it to the South Pole, but he turns back and he just makes it out again early February with all these people intact. And then, of course, later comes the Endurance expedition. But that choice of turning around at 88-23, that was perhaps even harder than any other choice he makes later in his career. And he's said to, when his wife speaks to him about this, he says, it's better to be a live donkey than a dead lion. Yeah. And of course he brings all these people back with him. And he has some private models in one way or another, finance and women and so forth, but he comes across, and the lower picture here is really Shackleton, not the upper one. He comes across as a superb leader in the field. And so if we summarize this, in my way, for whatever a Norwegian should be trusted to say of other countries, Robert Falcon Scott really has very few nice things to be said about him, except that he is an excellent writer, and he had enormous support of the establishment. Amundsen comes across as a good leader. Later on, he comes across also as a vindictive. He doesn't make drama, even when they have the similar conditions. Amundsen on the way north, going out, Scott on the way in. Scott always has worse weather than Amundsen under the same situation. Scott feels the weather worse. Amundsen thinks weather is nice. Shackleton, as I say, excellent leader under stress. And therefore, of course, he's become a hero in many management courses, first picked up by the Americans and later on by others. I put then right a question mark after Shackleton, because Shackleton today is known because of all the other books about Shackleton, all the books of good writers writing about Shackleton. We have to put this into a perspective. In 1913, February 1913, when Scott comes back, England is still the greatest naval power in the world, and it's building up to the First World War. This was a time when heroes were needed. And as we know, First World War was a meaningless slaughter of people, just killing each other. Dead heroes were the best heroes of all in some situations. For me, it is I cannot understand Scott and how he works in his mind. First of all, he does many errors, which I will not go into at depth now. But take one very clear example. He comes to 88-23, and by chance he happens to be on exactly the same day, 2 years later, that Shackleton is there. Now, obviously, at that point, Scott needed to go beyond 88-23. He needed to beat Shackleton, but he doesn't know that Amundsen has come to the South Pole. Now, at this point, he is worried about himself and the other four. He's worried about whether they can make it out again. Now, to me, a leader, a real big leader, then would have passed Shackleton by sufficient to be sure there would be no argument. Maybe go to 89 or 88-50 or something, and then say, okay, we've got to turn back. We cannot quite make it. We've made a good shot. We can't make it. Instead, he does not turn back, and over the next 2 months, he and the other four are all dead. Now that's not, to me, good leadership. But what happened in 1913 is that this was looked on. The most noble thing a man can do is to die for his country. Then when Huntford comes along and shows all the errors Scott has, and Huntford is a funny guy because he's got a chip on his shoulder in relation to the English, and we can philosophize on that. I know Huntford very well, and he goes overboard in making Scott a villain in all situations. And you don't have to do that. It's easy enough to recognize Scott's faults without making him bad in all respects. But Huntford, he really took the feet under Scott, and Scott then fell in public esteem in England from being among the top 5 or 10 heroes. Obviously Nelson is above, but there were not that many others. And then he dropped down, and in 2002 the BBC did a poll of the greatest heroes in England. Of course they have many of them, and Shackleton is 11th and Scott is 54th. When Shackleton came back, he was almost no hero, not from the Nimrod, yes, but after Scott was up there, and Shackleton was almost, for decades in England, almost unknown. He was brought back mostly by the Americans, and as I said, later on also in the UK. Amundsen didn't have any ambitions to do anything but reach the South Pole, make enough money, and then go north to the North Pole. That was his biggest thing. And of course he wanted to attain from a small country that was involved in polar exploration. Of course he wanted to be first in the South Pole. But he was a much simpler person than Scott. Scott was of course better educated and, as I say, a much better writer. And I think that's why Scott today stands out as a great person, because of his writing and not because of his choices. I once discussed this with Huntford, and I'm sure he wouldn't want me to quote him, but I will do so anyway. But Roland Huntford said to me that Amundsen was his greatest hero, by far. And then he said something which I've not forgotten, which I thought was interesting. He said, if Amundsen had been born in a different country, in a different time, in a big country that was at war, Amundsen could have been the kind of generals that would change history. Amundsen could have been like a Napoleon. Because Amundsen was so single-minded and so meticulous in his thinking and so good at getting people to do things with him that he could have changed history. And as I say, Huntford would have said totally different things and not very nice things about Scott. And I think that's part of Huntford's thing is one of these things that in itself is worth a study. Of course, Scott later on now, people have been starting to reappraise Scott in the light of that we have to see him in the light of his times. And of course that's changing slightly, we are understanding him better in a way than we are now. Finally, let me just finish with mention that Fram Museum is the museum which I come from. We built the building around the polar ship which we pulled ashore then in 1936. And now we are building a house also for Gjøa, and I know it's a long way from Hobart to Oslo, but if you ever want to see the polar ships, you should come there. And finally, I can't stop because at that note, without saying something about the value of Antarctic science. I mean, I come from a scientist, from the background, and why are we going to Antarctica today? We're not going to get the South Pole anymore. This is from the IPCC report. We are now constantly learning that Antarctica is contributing more to global sea level change. Perhaps the most important of all is the fact that we went down there to get, and we continue to go down there, get long climate records. This particular one is from an Australian program, from the Lordone, where they hope to then cover 1 million years of climate data, stored, of course, in these ice cores and in the air bubbles in the ice. We are seeing how the ice sheet is increasing its flow and contributing to sea level. And two of the most spectacular things going on right now. One is the search for life underneath the ice sheet, life perhaps that has been isolated for millions of years. What kind of life forms will we find? Nobody has any idea. We have to use the same kind of technology as looking at for extraterrestrial life on Mars, etc., without disturbing this. Both the British and the American and Russians, etc., are doing this in different places. And finally, just to give you an example of how crazy the Antarctic is, and I will not spend much time on this, but I have to explain it. This year they opened for the first time the complete array of the ice cube, which has been going on now for years at the South Pole Station, the American station. Apparently, when we have the Big Bang, and I'm not a physicist, something is formed called neutrinos, which are particles of practically no mass, of enormous amount of energy, and they're passing right through us all here at this moment. They're so big in energy, they're passing right through the Earth all the time. Okay? These particles, if you can detect them, you can also understand something about this start of the universe and the Big Bang. So this is fundamental physics. And I tried to detect them out in the Pacific by putting a lot of light detectors down in the Pacific, because sometimes when they hit the water molecule, they make a little flash. But the Pacific was too dirty. So the physicists came up with the idea that if we drill 5,000 detectors, 2,000 meters down in the ice, and we connect them all together, we should be able to detect these flashes ever so often, and then we can determine if we are having the Big Bang theory that we think we have. Isn't that crazy? That is the Antarctic. And finally, some things we will never see. Thank you.
Thank you, Olav. We do have time for some questions. There's a question up here to the right.
Thanks very much for a fantastic insight into Amundsen. I have a two-part question. First part is, I thought I'd better get in. The first part is just related to, I'm glad you sort of put a bit of an asterisk against Huntford's work. I've always felt a bit unsettled that Shackleton was promoted at the expense of Scott. You could argue that Scott's legacy is very powerful through Scott Polar Research and his son becoming a major conservationist and whatnot. And here in Australia with Mawson doing science, I wonder if you could comment on the legacy that Amundsen has left, both from Norway's political and scientific role in the Antarctic? And the second part of my question is a bit unrelated, but could you also comment a bit on that wonderful, juicy conspiracy theory that Amundsen perhaps died in Mexico in the 1950s? Thanks.
Well, let me finish with the first one. We are absolutely sure that Amundsen died in 1928. Let's start with that one. The problem with Amundsen is that he dies on a rescue mission up in the Arctic, and the plane that he was on, the Latin French plane, was never found, although they were found afloat from the plane later on. But that he had died in Mexico, there must have been somebody with a big nose maybe, but I think that's the only reason for such a idea. The legacy of Amundsen in terms of science and in terms of exploration is not as anywhere near what you might think in the Antarctic. Curiously enough, the Norwegian claim to Queen Maud Land, or Dronning Maud Land as we say, is not based on Amundsen. He named also the plateau around South Pole, King Håkon VII's plateau, but that was never recognized because you could not put the boundary of this plateau where that was. And all the exploration that was done along the coast was done by Lars Christensen, who was a Norwegian whaling magnate, and 5 different expeditions that he financed, one of the reasons being trying to find harbors for whaling, but also a genuine interest in science. So Amundsen's legacy in that sense in the Antarctic is not all that great. But of course we have his name, we have Amundsen Sea, we have other Amundsen names here.
There's a question. The microphone's coming down.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I'd just like to make one comment that Mawson didn't come back in 1912.
Sorry.
It was his ship.
Yeah, sorry.
And in fact, under Captain John King Davis, in his diary, tells us that they raised 3 cheers for Amundsen as they came into the Derwent, having found him there. But my question is really something that I think you've glossed over, which is definitely the one occasion on which I think Amundsen failed in leadership. And you recall he set off in the middle of September, early September, on his first attempt to get to the pole. And he came back because it was so cold. And he left some of his party behind. And when Johansen, who was one of the last to get in, finally reached the hut, Johansen upbraided Amundsen for his very, very poor leadership. And Amundsen then basically took it out on Johansen and said, "You're not coming to the pole," and was really fairly harsh on him. Could you comment on that as in relation to Amundsen as a great leader?
Yes, there's no question. When they start out in early September, that was too early. They had a few mild days by the at the station at Orheim, and they discussed this, and they collectively decided to start going south. And within 2 days, it's getting very, very cold. And then they have a discussion at the other end, and they decide that we got to turn back. Up to that point, there's no disagreement about the story, and there's also no disagreement on the facts, namely that they came back in pretty sort of disorderly fashion. And the last 2 people to come is Johansen and Gjertsen. Gjertsen badly frostbitten feet at this point. Amundsen says that he felt everybody should be making their way back as quickly as possible, and they come back at different speeds. And the reason for that was to have a minimum amount of frost damage to them. Johansen's way of describing this is that he felt Amundsen was cowardly, and that's what he says to him the next morning. And he thought that the leader should have been the last one to go, and he should have been helping the last one. There was no blows, there were no fighting down there, but Amundsen looked on this comment of him being cowardly as a criticism that he felt that Johansen was committing mutiny. And he takes him possibly off the South Pole party, although I think by all accounts it is not likely Johansen ever would have gone to the South Pole. When they started out the first time, they were 8, remember? And I don't think Amundsen had that intention. Amundsen did not want to have Johansen along on this expedition. Amundsen was told by Nansen to take along Johansen. Johansen at this point is a very complicated person back home in Norway. He was the hero together with Nansen when they tried to reach the North Pole and wintered over in Franz Josef Land. But in opposition to Nansen, he cannot handle the number of honors, including all the people who wanted to have a drink with him when he came back to Norway. Johansen becomes an alcoholic. When he's going down to the South Pole, his wife has left him with 4 children. It was a court case where she was granted a divorce in the courts, and that was a big thing in 100+ years ago. And he has lost his job as the station commander of a small military outpost in the north. And he was basically become a drunkard. And Nansen, who several times helped Johansen, they spent the winter in the sleeping bag together. Nansen wanted to give Johansen another chance and was sure that taking him to the Antarctic would keep him sober, which it probably did, and because they didn't have much alcohol. And so Nansen says to Amundsen, "You got to take Johansen." Now, what then happens later on is that Hjalmar Johansen is sent as demoted, if you like, to go with the other two to explore King Edward VII Land. And then they come back on the ship, back to Hobart. And I and many others thought that Amundsen could have done differently when they come to Hobart. He could have said, look, what happened down in the ice happened in the ice. We will not talk about this, we'll put a line across it, and we will just go back and we will keep quiet on this. Amundsen could have done that, and they would have stayed like that, at least for a long time. Amundsen doesn't do that. He sends Johansen back, and when I was younger, before we saw the diaries, we were thinking this was a one-sided thing from Amundsen. But we see that on the trip from Bay of Whales and back to Hobart, Johansen is confiding in one of the others that he doesn't want to be on the ship any longer, and so he hopes that the boss will let him go back by other means back to Norway. So this was mutual, but there's no question that Amundsen did not want to have Johansen around himself any longer than necessary. And fantastic thing in those days is that the media respects this. The media does not interview Johansen about his side of the story, and of course it comes out later. But and Amundsen writes about it, but he does not bring out this, what I said about Johansen calling him a coward, and that other part that comes on later on. And then of course Johansen commits suicide, but I think it would be very unfair to put that completely on the South Pole expedition. I think his wife leaving him was probably even bigger blow. A long answer, sorry.
Good time for about one more question, if there's a question. There you go, just there.
Hi, my concern is, my main interest is the Fram, and I'm wondering whether the links between Australia and Norway with the Fram have been fully explored, given that that was a major part of this expedition. Because the boat was built by Colin Archer, and Colin Archer's family was Australian, and Colin had been in Australia before returning to Norway and building the Fram, and I think that's something for Australia to celebrate, that it's an Australian family.
The Fram was, and still is, the conventional ship that's been furthest north and furthest south. Still today, even though it's more than 100 years ago that it was built. Colin Archer, I believe, was here for a few years. His brother stayed on here. So I do think there's a link that you should be exploring much more, and maybe we can do something about that in mutually. His home in Norway is still standing there. It's actually been restored as a museum, and of course he built many ships, many famous ships in Norway, which he had started shipbuilding before Nansen goes to him in 1890, and Fram was launched in 1892.
Okay, I'll just close in a moment, but before I do, I want to just make it clear and for the record that it was neither Scott nor Mawson who returned in 1913. It was the news of Scott that returned in 1913. That's all very clear now.
Mawson did return, though.
Yes, but not in the way that was meant. Okay, so I think that was a wonderful trail through the expedition of Mawson and into the interstices of what happened here in Amundsen.
That's okay. That's okay. We can have brotherhood.
This is the Norwegians versus the Australians, of course. And as you know, there's a reenactment of the sending of the telegram, which is going to occur on Sunday. And I suppose many of you will be there. I'm not quite sure that you'll still be here.
I'll go the day before.
Yeah, you won't be here by that. But it's been a great pleasure having you with us for the last little while, and it will be for the next few days. And I enjoyed thoroughly your seminar this evening. I hope you could put your hands together one more time for Olav. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
That was very good.
Yeah.
That was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks, Olav.
Yeah, whatever happened. I thought I put it on, but
No, it's you've missed out. It doesn't matter.
I think